Jesus, as we tackle another difficult topic this week, I just pray, Jesus, that you would again just hide me behind your cross, that it wouldn't be the words that I am speaking, but it would be you speaking through me, and that you would be speaking into the hearts of the people here today. Jesus, I pray that you would open our hearts to receive from you. Amen. So last week we began this series by looking at gay marriage and homosexuality. If you missed last week's message, I encourage you to find it online on our website and give it a listen. I think it was pretty accurate, if I do say so myself. But again, I think it's important to be upfront with you that this is a biblical thing that we're going to look at today. This is something we're going to address from what the Bible says. It's more important that we look at these topics from what the Bible says, more so than what the United Methodist Church even tells us. So we look at these issues, and I want to again ask you that as we address another hard topic, that there are going to be things that are going to strike a personal chord with you. And if you're tempted to immediately get angry, I just ask you to question yourself with one thing. Why? Why? Why does this make me angry? I'll be honest with you. I think last week's topic was a lot easier to address than this week's. Today we look at divorce. So why is it so difficult to address this topic? Well, these are my numbers. But biblically, when we look at divorce, the Bible gives us about 30% of black and white. This is what they said about divorce. And about 70% is gray area. So there's a lot more ifs, or maybe, or what about, that you're going to have tons of those questions. Because as I've gone through this and I've been planning for this, it was like one thing after another. I would come up with something, I would address it, and I would be excited about it. I'd go tell Jennifer, and she was like, well, what about this? I'm like, stop saying that, because you're just making this message a lot longer. So thank her when we get out of here at 1. Notice she's not here today. No. It won't be that long, I promise. So marriage. First, to understand divorce, we have to understand marriage, right? It's kind of go hand in hand, unfortunately. But God's plan for marriage is what we need to start out with. And God's plan for marriage is that it is a covenant for life that is only dissolved by death. It's intimate. And it's between one man and one woman. Biblical marriage. Scripture references for you. Last week, we even looked at this area of this idea of love. See, in our English language, there's one word for love, and it's love, and there's one definition of what that love is. But in the Greek, there's actually 4 words for the meaning of love. The first one is agape, which is God's love. It's the supreme love. There's no other love greater than God's love. And the next one is phileo, which is friendship or brotherly love. Then storge, which is a protective love or a parental love, a love that a parent has for a child. But then there's eros, which is romantic love. And the thing is, we can't take away agape. If we take away agape love, then really eros isn't there. It's impossible for us to have that romantic love for another person because it was created in God's love. Throughout the Bible, you see this language of the church being the bride of Christ. Well, God uses this marriage language because marriage is one of the most sacred relationships that you will ever enter into. Because marriage is the only covenant that encompasses all four of these types of love. It's the only relationship that has eros in it. So we have God's plan for marriage, a lifelong commitment. When you enter into that commitment, you know that this is for life. This is till death do us part, for better or for worse. Whoever this woman turns out to be, I'm staying. Whoever this guy decides he wants to be, I'm staying. Despite how hard things get. So where did divorce come from? Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 says this: If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. And if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. There's a whole lot of stuff in there, right? So why do we even have God giving the giving the law of divorce to the people? It's quite simple, really. The law was given to govern the practice of divorce. Divorce was to be tolerated, but it was never commanded, and it was never divinely approved of. It was not God's plan. But unfortunately, because of Adam and Eve going clear back to the Garden of Eden, because of their sin, entering the world, and because of our sinful nature as humans, God gives us a law to govern our marriages. So God gives us this law to govern our relationships. So where did things kind of go wrong? Where did things kind of go adrift? Well, you see, by the time Jesus came on the picture, the Pharisees, or the teachers of the law, they had taken Moses' law and they had kind of taken it from the broadest stance possible. You see where Moses says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, the Pharisees interpreted this in the broadest way possible, going so far as to say that a husband could divorce his wife if she did anything to displease him. Guess what, women? Bad cook? You're gone. Hard to get along with? See ya. Didn't keep the house clean enough? Bye. Unable to have children? Overweight? Better exercise. Oh, by the way, at the same time, don't get old. You got to stay young. You think I'm kidding. But seriously, it was anything. Because they literally took the broadest sense possible. You see, they neglected what God really had ordained marriage to be. They had forgotten that marriage was to be a sacred covenant between two people. And they had taken it to the lowest places of a relationship. So I'm sure you're all wondering, so get to the point. When is divorce acceptable? Well, believe it or not, there's only two things in the Bible that are specific in its speaking. There are two places where it's explicit that these are two things that are acceptable for a divorce to take place in a relationship. Matthew 19 says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea, to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore God has joined them together. Let no one separate. Why then, they ask, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So here we see number one, adultery. Sexual immorality to a spouse that is unfaithful, to a spouse who has an affair with another man or woman. It's an acceptable, legitimate reason for divorce. Because they have broken that covenant relationship that the marriage was to be between one man and one woman. Jesus is reminding the Pharisees that when they took this oath, that when you take this marriage covenant, that it's no longer two people, but you become one flesh in the sight of God. And when you become one flesh, there is no dividing something that has become one. But yet with divorce, the whole point is to separate. Number two, it's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I'll read it and then we'll go back through it because there's a whole lot of stuff here. Starting in verse 10, it says, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. So let's stop there before we go any farther, just so we don't confuse you too much. He says, to the married, I give this command. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried. Because if she entered into another relationship, then she would be guilty of committing adultery. But she wouldn't just be guilty of the sin of adultery herself. She would be guilty of making the other person commit adultery as well. Because that person was also entering into a relationship that he technically should not have been, he or she should not have been entering into. So they both would be then therefore guilty of adultery. Verse 12 says, to the rest I say this, I, again, not the Lord. If any brother, stop right there. He says brother. So when he says brother, he's literally referring to a fellow follower of Christ, just to clarify. So if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. So one is a follower of Christ, one is not a follower of Christ. If she is willing to live with him, he cannot divorce her because she's not a follower of Christ. Okay? And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. Again, same scenario, just reversed. Okay? But for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound to such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. So now, if the unbeliever in that relationship, so again, one is a believer, one is not a believer, if the unbeliever leaves, it's okay to divorce. What they're talking about here is called desertion. So one of the two decides to leave or give up on the relationship. In my understanding, another reason for this desertion we have to look at in the context of when it was written. You see, in that time, a woman and a child, the only way that they would really survive is if they were attached to a man. Because it was the man who worked, it was the man who provided the shelter, it was the man who provided the food that goes on the table for you to eat. And so if a child and a mother were separated from a man, they would literally live on the streets. And we even find in the early church that they began to take in these women and these children and support them and give them the things that they needed because they had just been left. And without a man, they would be alone. But see, if a man left and the woman and the child were still there, but yet she could not divorce from the man, then there was no way for her to be able to survive except on the streets. But if she could divorce that man for leaving the relationship, then she could divorce them and be able to enter into another relationship and not commit adultery. So it was also a way to survive. At the beginning of this passage in verse 10, it says a husband and wife must remain together. But what if I'm unhappy? I'm not happy with this person anymore. They don't make me happy. Most divorce cases go before the court and it's called irreconcilable differences. She doesn't get me. He doesn't get me. He doesn't do this. She doesn't do this. And when they blame each other, pretty much what it boils down to is you don't make me happy anymore. But we have to ask ourselves a very, very, very hard question. Is your happiness God's number one desire for you? Is your happiness God's number one desire for you? It's not. His number one desire for you is that you have a relationship with him. It's number one. So it's not about the happiness that we have. Because you see, if we get the relationship with God part right, we're going to get the relationship with our spouse part right. But what about an abusive person? Because I even struggle with this one. This was one of the things that I struggled with and coming up with. But why would God want a woman who's being abused and beaten to stay in a relationship like that? Why would God want a woman who knows that her children are being abused by her husband? Why would he want them to stay in a relationship like that? We also have to remember that Jesus said that we were to abide by the authority put over us. The government that was over us. That we were to be under the authority of the law of the land. Well, if a mother or father knows that their child is being abused and does not leave that relationship, does not remove their child from that abusive relationship, the law says that that person is also legally liable for criminal charges if they willingly keep their children in an abusive environment. So what about that? How do we answer that question? Well, it kind of goes and we look at this thing in a whole new different dynamic. But really not. We're looking at it from the very beginning. Because marriage was a covenant, right? It was a covenant relationship between one man, one woman, meant for life. But we see that both Christ's teaching on adultery and divorce and Paul's instructions on desertion and divorce reflect God's covenantal design for marriage. And out of that, we find that there are four main purposes for a marriage covenant. Four main purposes. The first one is the spiritual partnership and mutual edification of husband and wife in pursuing the will of God together. So the spiritual partnership and mutual edification. The best way to grow together in our faith is with another person. Another person to hold us accountable to our actions. And so that relationship is also mainly built around the spiritual partnership of following God's design for our lives. Number two, the procreation of children and the nurturing of the human family. Kids, ask your parents later what procreation means. So the creating of children and the nurturing of the human family. God meant for the children to be brought up in a home that was with a man and a woman. We can look at statistics until we're blue in the face, and they will always point to the fact that children grow up in healthier relationships and grow up to have healthier relationships when they are in a home raised with a husband and a father, and a mother. I'll eventually get these right. When a father and a mother are present. Number three, the development of spiritual intimacy and the fulfillment of sexual pleasures through conjugal love. Yes, it's sex. We're talking about sex here. And it's meant to be between a man and a woman who are united in marriage, who have made that covenant to one another. Number four, to protect against lust, immorality, and sexual temptations. Paul says earlier in that 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that if he could instruct people in what he would suggest is that people not marry. Because when people get married, that means they have one more distraction between them and God. They can't give all of their attention to God, and so they can get distracted, and that relationship can pull them away from God. So he was saying, let's just take out all possibilities of that and just stay single and devote yourself to God. But he says, if you have lusts or you are tempted sexually, then it's best for you to get married. Because it's better to be married than to continue in a life of sin, he says. You see, it's when we understand marriage as a covenant, it follows that any violations of any one of the 4 covenant purposes could institute grounds for divorce. So any violation of those 4 could be grounds for divorce. So physical abuse, refusal to work and support your family, illicit or illegal activities that threaten the safety of the family. Women, listen to this. Refusal to engage in marital sex. Refusal to bear or care for children. And let me add to that one really quick. That's not saying if you're not able to have children, they get to divorce you. That's not the case. There's a difference between refusal to have a child and not being able to have a child. There's a difference there. Unrepentant addiction to pornography, alcoholism, or drug abuse, leaving the home for long periods of time. That's the desertion part. So, how should we deal with divorce? There's a whole lot of ifs, what abouts. How should we deal when it comes with the situation of a divorce? Very easily, case by case. There's no relationship in here or no divorce that has taken place that we can say you all get put in this side of the room and you're all the same and all your relationships fall under you've been divorced. You can't. There's too many scenarios. There's too many possibilities of things that would be different that we don't have maybe a straight answer for. Statistically, we have found that divorce is unhealthy. We like to say that the kids will get over it. They'll be able to deal with it, after a little bit of time, and, they'll eventually grow beyond it. What they found is that children of divorce end up struggling in their relationships as adults. They're constantly worried about what could potentially happen. I don't know how many men I've talked to that are afraid to get married. They're afraid to propose to their girlfriends because they're afraid that they'll do the same thing that their parents did. They don't want to be like their parents. And they're afraid that they're going to, and so they just distance themselves from marriage. James Dobson, with Focus on the Family, said, research consistently shows that heterosexual married adults do better in virtually every measure of emotional and physical health than people who are divorced or never married. They will live longer. They will have happier lives. They will recover from illness more quickly, earn and save more money, and are more reliable employees, suffer less stress, are less likely to become victims of any kind of violence. They find the job of parenting more enjoyable, and they are more satisfying and fulfilling in their sexual lives. The divorce rate, has recently, in the last 5-10 years, at least I've heard it this way, that divorce in the church is now the same as people who don't attend church or don't go to church. Well, in my deeper studies, I have found that there has been no reliable report or research that has been published that states that it's 50-50. It's actually not. It's more like 31% in the church. But they found that couples who are in the church, that are involved in the church, are less likely to be divorced than people who occasionally attend or are not associated with the church at all. Why is that? Because hopefully they've realized that the key to their relationship is found in that marriage covenant. That as you stood before a pastor, and God ordained this relationship, and God's blessing was put on this relationship, that it was meant for something greater than themselves. I remember when I had graduated from high school, and I went and I stayed with my aunt and uncle who were not Christians. I stayed with them for the summer, and they took me to this fancy restaurant, and they sat across from the table, and they had the talk. Not the sex talk, they had the relationship talk. And they said to me words I'll never forget. We love each other, but there are days we will not like each other. And I realize that every day means I have to work at this relationship. And I realized I don't get a day off. I don't get to be married one day and not the next. Every day I have to work at my relationship. And if Jennifer was here, she'd tell you the same thing. I tell couples that I counsel before I perform weddings, I tell them this important thing. Jennifer and I decided when we got married that we would remove a word from our vocabulary. Divorce. That when we get angry with each other, we're not going to use it as a threat. We're not going to say, oh fine, we'll just get a divorce. We're not going to use it as a weapon to each other to get the other person to do something we want them to do. If we're struggling in our relationship, we're going to be honest with each other. We're going to tell each other what we're feeling. We're going to have arguments. We're going to have disagreements. But we're going to realize that tomorrow, I still love this person. And the reason I'm fighting for this relationship is because I love you. And I know that I love you because of God in our relationship. One reason that I've discovered that relationships fail is because couples don't realize what their true priorities should be. Because when we look through the Bible and we look and we study about marriage and divorce, we realize that God was meant to be number one. No matter what. It's not my spouse. And hear this, it's not my kids that should be number one. It should be God as number one priority in my life. And here's the important part. Number two is my relationship with my spouse. Not my kids. And that's where a lot of couples have gotten in trouble, is because the second you have kids, all of your love and all of your attention now turns to these beautiful little kids. And I'm sure they're all beautiful to you, but no, anyway. But you turn all your love and your attention to them. And so we created a word for it. It's called empty nest syndrome, because these beautiful little kids grew up and they left the house, and now you sit across from the couch and you look at this person that is now a complete stranger. You say, I'm not happy anymore. Because you've totally forgotten how to relate to that person because you dumped your marriage to raise your kids. God never intended you to do that. He expected you to raise your children together. And He created you to be an example to them. Because what do we do the second we have kids? What do we stop doing to each other as husband and wife? We stop dating. We stop going out and doing things together. We always have the kids with us. We're always doing something for them or running them here and there. But we never take the time, because the time the kids are in bed, it's like, I'm exhausted. We're going to bed. And you never take the time to build into that relationship. I don't care how old you are or how young you are. If you are married, I encourage you to have a date night. And I'm speaking to myself here when I say this. Jennifer and I try to do it, but we don't do it nearly enough. You need to take the time to build into each other's lives, to rekindle that relationship that you once had. And here's the thing, you may not like that other person anymore. Why don't you like them? And find why you love them. Because Jesus never said your relationship was to be built on the things you like about someone. It was to be the things you love about a person. Because when you focus on your love, it will never divide you. It will only bring you together. But if you focus on the things that agitate you, good luck. You know, we always tell our kids, even if we are just like having a disagreement, like not yelling, just like voicing our opinions to each other, Samantha always comes running in the room and says, stop fighting, stop fighting. And Jennifer and I have this phrase that we always tell them, we may not like each other right now, but we love each other. Because you see, that's the most important thing that your children need to see. Your children need to see that you love each other despite your differences, despite your arguments. Our kids hate us being affectionate to each other. It's always, don't do that. But here's the thing. Why is that important? Why do Jennifer and I do that? And I'm not talking about like making out, like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, hugging each other, holding hands, kissing each other. I'm talking about that kind of stuff. Why do we do that? Because we want them to know that even though we argue, this is where we're going to come back to. We're going to come back to the love part. We're going to come back to making each other a priority in our lives. Because that's what God created us to do in this relationship. Is divorce wrong? Yeah. Is it a sin? I don't know. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't know. I'd love to just be able to give you a blanket answer and say, yep, this, but I can't. I can't judge you and say that you're wrong and you're sinning and I can't and I won't. And that's the same stance the United Methodist Church takes. We don't want people to get divorced. But to a degree, we realize we can't stop you. But we're going to love you anyway. Because we're sinful too. But as the song says before I came up here, we're all broken. And the sooner you realize that the best relationship is when you can be broken together, you'll realize that a relationship can have bumps and still be good. So I hope you'll take that and think about it a little bit. Yes. God builds churches with broken people. If we didn't have broken people, we wouldn't need to be here, would we? But to a degree, thank God we're broken.